meant the man who was cooked alive for stealing bread. His screams echoed through the palace halls, a warning carved into memory and stone. These punishments weren't just rare. They were little-known horrors, written into law and carried out under the strict rules of Ma'at, Egypt's cosmic order. Back then, justice didn't just mean a slap on the wrist. It meant agony by design, all approved by the state. Stay with me while we lift Egypt's golden curtain to reveal justice's darkest secrets. Because what happened to that bread thief was just the beginning. Let's talk about the palace kitchen, not the place you'd want to end up if you were caught stealing. In ancient Egypt, boiling alive wasn't just a threat whispered in dark corridors. It was a real punishment, carried out with precision and a chilling sense of order. Temple reliefs from the New Kingdom show prisoners being lowered into massive vessels, their faces twisted in agony. Archaeological evidence points to large bronze cauldrons stored in royal complexes, sometimes right alongside regular kitchen equipment. These weren't for soup. Here's how the process usually went. Officials had a choice: kill quickly or make it last. The most documented method involved slowly heating water with the condemned inside, so the pain stretched out as long as possible. Some records mention the occasional use of oil for a faster, more intense death, but water was the classic approach. Cooks, yes, actual palace cooks, were sometimes present to manage the temperature, making sure the execution didn't end too soon. It was like a nightmare version of quality control. The sensory details were impossible to escape. The smell of burning flesh mixed with regular food, seeping through palace corridors. Imagine trying to serve Pharaoh's dinner while hearing screams echoing from the next room. Officials recorded firewood expenses for their vessels of justice right alongside kitchen supplies, showing just how routine this kind of terror became in palace life. Who ended up in the cauldron? Temple thieves were the usual suspects. One papyrus from Deir el-Medina describes a worker who stole gold leaf from a shrine and faced execution as priests watched. Traitors, too. A vizier's records mention a batch of would-be assassins boiled for plotting against Amenhotep III. Even status didn't always protect you. A nobleman named Pacer was caught faking tax records and ended up in the pot, proving that the law reached all the way up the social ladder. Medical experts estimate that a person fully submerged in boiling water might die in 3 to 5 minutes. But Egyptian reliefs often show victims only half immersed, which meant the pain could last much longer. Some later Greek accounts claim to have witnessed men survive for up to 15 minutes in these cauldrons, though historians now take these stories with a grain of salt. Still, the message was clear. Suffering was part of the sentence. The design of the equipment tells its own story. One reconstructed cauldron from fragments found near Memphis had ridges inside to keep victims from climbing out, and heavy handles for tipping them in headfirst. Palace walls even had recipes scratched into them, listing which oils burned the hottest. Olive oil was a favorite, but animal fat got the job done when they wanted extra smoke. Why would anyone engineer a cauldron this sophisticated? The answer lies in fear as a tool of power. The state didn't just want to punish, it wanted everyone to see and remember what happened when you broke the rules. And as you'll see, boiling was only one of the ways ancient Egypt made sure nobody forgot the price of disobedience. In ancient Egypt, your skin wasn't just a layer of protection, it was your ticket to the afterlife. Lose it, and you lost your identity for eternity. Flaying was more than punishment, it was a sentence designed to erase you from both this world and the next. Medical texts found at Saqqara show that priests believed skin held a person's essence. Strip it away, and the soul would wander, unable to recognize its own body. The process started with ropes. Executioners tied victims face down on limestone slabs at Thebes, the grooves cut deep to hold limbs still. No anesthetic, no promise of a swift cut, just raw copper flesh teasers. Copper hooks, not knives, did most of the work, peeling skin in ragged strips instead of clean incisions. Doctors who studied the remains say the pain would be beyond anything modern medicine can treat. Historical records, like a Persian ambassador's report, describe the process beginning at the ankles and working upward, with victims often conscious for hours as their skin was removed. One medical papyrus even warns that survivors could endure agony for many hours before shock or blood loss finally ended it. But the cruelty didn't stop there. Ramesses II's reign left records of skin nailed to city gates with bronze spikes. At Karnak, temple scribes tracked whose hide hung where, and some skins stayed up for months until they rotted away. Workers at Deir el-Medina wrote complaints about having to pass the leather of the thief Amenemhat every day on their way to work. Can you imagine walking past your coworker's skin nailed to the city gate each morning? Why go to these extremes? In Egyptian belief, the afterlife demanded a complete body. Without skin, you couldn't be recognized by the gods. The Book of Gates describes flayed souls wandering the Duat forever, unable to eat or drink. A priest's manual from Abydos even includes spells to deny the skinless one rest. The punishment fit the crime. Temple robbers were flayed from the feet up, forced to watch it happen. Political traitors often lost their facial skin first, making them strangers in both life and death. Archaeologists have found evidence of salt rubbed into exposed flesh, not to heal, but to make the pain last longer. Worker graffiti at Giza even jokes about an official who lost his temper and his skin the same day. The tools were specialized. Excavations at Memphis turned up flaying kits with different hooks, wide for limbs, narrow for fingers. Some copper instruments showed heavy wear, pointing to frequent use. One burial near Luxor held an executioner's kit, complete with a blade labeled "For the Living" in hieratic script. This wasn't just a punishment for commoners. Records mention high-ranking officials losing more than just their rank. They lost their skin when they defied Pharaoh. Tax documents from the reign of Merneptah list payments for cleaning the wall of skins at the palace. The Ebers medical papyrus even has a recipe for ointment to treat hand sores from repeated skinning sessions. The psychological impact was real. After public flaying, temple inventories show thefts plummeted. A vizier scroll even brags that displaying skins cut corruption among tax collectors in half. The threat was clear. Steal from the state and you'd lose more than your possessions. You'd lose your place in eternity. Yet compared to what some faced next, even this seems almost merciful. The Egyptians had a way of turning something sweet into pure torture. Honey wasn't just for offerings or dessert, it became a tool for execution. Picture this. You're tied to a wooden post at the edge of a desert, stripped naked and slathered from head to toe in honey and date syrup. Not just your arms and legs, every inch, even your eyes, ears, and nose. This wasn't some wild rumor. Records from remote border forts document this punishment for spies, deserters, and those who betrayed the state. The executioners didn't pick just any spot. They chose places near marshes or the desert edge where insects swarmed in the heat. Once the honey was applied, the real torment began. Various desert insects, sweat-seeking bees, biting ants, and flesh flies zeroed in on the sugar glaze. The honey trapped body heat, creating a perfect breeding ground for maggots. Medical texts from Saqqara mention that victims often died from infection before dehydration could finish the job. We even have prisoner accounts scratched onto pottery shards at border posts like Buin. One described watching a fellow captive swell like rotting fruit after 2 days. Another, a Libyan mercenary, wrote about the endless buzzing, each hour bringing more insects. Guards sometimes placed bets on how long someone would last. Some traditions claim victims survived up to 5 days, but most didn't make it nearly that long. But this horror wasn't hidden away. It was staged for everyone. Unlike the private executions reserved for palace halls, honey-coated punishments happened in public, right at crossroads or market entrances. Temple records show officials timed these events for festival days when crowds were biggest. A vizier's journal even brags about arranging one during the Feast of Opet so all Thebes could watch the traitor twitch. Death came in waves. First, the stings and bites, thousands of them, relentless and inescapable. Then, as the hours dragged on, maggots hatched and burrowed into living flesh, compounding the agony. Medical papyri describe skin turning black from necrosis, and most victims died from shock or blood poisoning within a few days. The setup was simple but effective. Archaeologists found posts at Aswan with grooves for ropes and traces of honey in the wood. Some posts even had small platforms, not for comfort, but to keep scavenging animals from ending the spectacle too soon. This punishment was all about humiliation as much as pain. Egyptian texts talk about how victims danced without music, jerking and writhing from the constant torment. After one public honey execution at Memphis, army desertion rates dropped sharply. A priest's letter complained that insects lingered at the site for weeks, calling them the gods' cleaners. Some officials tried to argue this was a merciful end, claiming, "The insects bring sleep." Tell that to the Libyan spy whose last words were, "They're in my eyes." His bones were all that remained after the scavengers finished. Of course, public suffering wasn't limited to honey and insects. Egypt had another method, one that involved wood, iron, and a kind of spectacle that would inspire empires to come. Impaling was Egypt's answer to public punishment, a method as much about humiliation as it was about pain. Archaeological digs suggest Egypt practiced impaling centuries earlier than the Romans, and their approach was every bit as calculated. Instead of nailing someone sideways to a cross, Egyptian executioners drove a sharpened stake vertically through the body. It was a spectacle built for maximum impact, both physically and psychologically. The tools of the trade were simple but brutal. Near Memphis, archaeologists have found remnants of ancient execution sites, with acacia wood posts that still bear traces of blood and splinters. Acacia wasn't chosen for its strength. It splintered easily, causing more damage as the victim struggled. Temple reliefs show metal reinforcements at the base to keep the stake steady, making sure the condemned stayed upright until the bitter end. Executioners didn't improvise. New Kingdom texts describe how the shape of the stake depended on the crime. Blunt stakes meant a slow, torturous death as organs were ruptured over hours. Sharper points were reserved for spies or traitors, giving them a quicker end. There's even a military scroll that boasts about impaling 200 Nubian rebels along a road, leaving the bodies as a warning to anyone passing by. The process was gruesome and methodical. Executioners learned exactly where to drive stakes to prolong life without immediate death. Medical papyri describe victims remaining conscious for hours, sometimes even a full day, as internal bleeding built up. Prison records from Thebes note that younger, healthier victims could survive up to 3 days, while older prisoners often died within hours. When the suffering dragged on too long, guards sometimes ended things with arrows or rocks, not out of mercy, but to clear the post for the next in line. Not all impalements were the same. Political enemies of Pharaoh got the standard treatment, tall stakes for maximum visibility, but temple robbers faced a different kind of horror. Shorter stakes that left them alive just long enough for scavengers to start picking at exposed flesh. One priestly manual spells out the difference, saving the worst for those who stole from the gods. The message was clear, and it worked. Herodotus wrote about seeing rows of impaled bodies lining Egyptian trade routes, a living billboard warning others to stay in line. Soldiers' letters mentioned that just the sight of stakes being prepared was enough to make prisoners confess on the spot. A tax collector even bragged in his journal about doubling his revenue after a public impalement in the town square. If you think this was rare, think again. Some stakes were reused with forensic analysis, revealing DNA from multiple victims soaked deep into the wood. One post from Karnak had layers of blood built up over decades, a silent record of just how routine this punishment became. So, if you ever found yourself on the wrong side of Egyptian law, the choice wasn't really yours. A quick end if you were lucky, or days of agony under the sun if you weren't. But as terrifying as physical pain was, the Egyptians believed there was something far worse than death itself. Imagine living forever, except your name doesn't exist. In ancient Egypt, the worst punishment wasn't pain or even death. It was being erased so completely that your soul had nowhere to go. Egyptians believed you needed your name and image to exist in the afterlife. Remove those and you doomed someone to wander in darkness, forgotten by both the living and the gods. This wasn't just a threat whispered in tomb corridors. Teams of workers, sometimes called removers of names, went out with chisels and sandpaper to wipe every trace of a condemned person. Archaeologists have found tombs where names were scraped away so thoroughly that only flecks of paint survived. At Abydos, workers even erased every hieroglyph containing a part of the forbidden person's name or face. Priests didn't stop at physical removal. They held ceremonies where they read spells backward and burned papyri with the target's name, or killed images by carving spears through them. At Saqqara, someone drilled holes through the eyes of every portrait in a vizier's tomb, just to make sure he couldn't see his way into the afterlife. This wasn't just vandalism, it was a calculated ritual. Whole family lines could disappear. During Ramses III's reign, officials cut disgraced relatives out of temple family trees. At Karnak, workers plastered over names and painted new ones on top. The emotional impact was brutal. People lost not just their spot in history, but their connection to loved ones and the hope of being remembered. The Book of the Dead made it clear. Your soul needed your name spoken to survive. No name meant no offerings, no prayers, no existence. One priest from Memphis bragged, "I will make his name more forgotten than last year's floods." And it worked. At Deir el-Medina, about 1 in 20 tombs has evidence of erasure, usually for crimes like embezzling temple goods. Sometimes the punishment reached beyond the grave. Officials erased names from census rolls, temple kitchens stopped listing them in offering records, and even medical texts crossed out remedies by disgraced doctors. Over time, the methods got more precise. Early dynasties just chipped away names, but by the New Kingdom, ghost hieroglyphs appeared. Outlines left behind after removal, only visible under special lighting. Scientists have used imaging tech at Luxor to spot these erased names under layers of plaster. Some pharaohs, like Hatshepsut, had their names replaced rather than erased, with new carvings right over the old ones. Family members sometimes risked everything to restore erased names, only to end up erased themselves. The most extreme punishment was total destruction. In Akhenaten's abandoned city, workers dismantled whole tombs and ground burial items into pigment for paint. The message was clear. If you crossed the wrong person, your memory could be wiped out completely. If the idea of living without a name chills you, hit like and share so more people can learn how power once used fear to control the soul. But these punishments weren't just random acts of cruelty. There was a system behind every horror, a set of laws written in ink and stone, making sure everyone knew exactly what was at stake. You might think ancient Egypt's punishments were all about brute force, but the real power was in the paperwork. The law scrolls of pain were as methodical as any tax code. Archaeologists have found legal scrolls right next to grain tallies and temple rosters, spelling out exactly how, when, and why someone should be punished. There's a ledger from Thebes that lists flaying tools, with the same casual tone as incense for offerings. In Egypt, pain wasn't just allowed, it was organized. Judges didn't just pick punishments out of thin air. They trained for years, learning how to match every crime to its cosmic consequence. The guiding principle was always ma'at, the balance that kept the universe from falling apart. If you upset ma'at, you didn't just owe a debt, you became a lesson. Manuals from Memphis lay it out. Steal from a neighbor, and you might lose a hand. Steal from Pharaoh, and you could lose your skin, your name, or both. The legal texts didn't leave much to the imagination. Instead of dramatic quotes about boiling oil or the right angle for a steak, the scrolls broke down punishments in chilling detail. Laws prescribed things like boil until the flesh separates, or set out the number of blows, the type of wood, or even the temperature for cooking traitors. Everything had a procedure. Even spiritual erasure came with instructions. How deep to scrape a name, which chisel to use, and which spells to recite as you did it. Crimes against the state got special treatment. Tax evasion was stealing the breath of Egypt, and scribes caught underreporting harvests sometimes ended up impaled as an example. One vizier's journal records a mass punishment. Today, we filled 6 cauldrons. These weren't just acts of rage, they were warnings calculated for maximum effect. A single public flaying could make an entire district suddenly honest about their taxes. Temple crimes were in a league of their own. Touch a sacred statue, and the law might order honey and insects to cleanse the defilement. Even accidents could get brutal responses. There's a record of a carpenter losing both hands after dropping a tool near a holy altar. The system left little room for second chances. Judges sometimes debated the best way to make a point. One court transcript describes officials arguing whether a suspected spy should be boiled alive for speed or flayed for spectacle. They chose flaying, writing in the record that the skin warns longer. That's the kind of logic that makes your skin crawl. All this wasn't just about keeping order, it was about sending a message, not just to the victim, but to anyone watching. The paperwork was more chilling than the flame. Ma'at's balance demanded suffering, and the law delivered. And if you think that was harsh, just wait until you see how these punishments played out in front of a crowd. In ancient Egypt, executions were more than punishments. They were public theater. Town squares and temple courtyards doubled as venues for these grim performances, with permanent stone platforms built for the sole purpose of displaying pain. Archaeologists have uncovered platforms in Thebes and Memphis with grooves for draining blood and slots for restraining victims. Some even show wear from generations of spectators crowding in for a better view. Scheduling was no accident. Temple records from Karnak reveal that executions were planned for market days and festivals, making sure the largest possible crowd witnessed every moment. One vizier's journal mentions timing a flaying to coincide with the harvest festival, so even farmers' children would see. "Let them learn young," he wrote. The same account notes that extra guards were needed to keep eager onlookers from getting too close to the action. Crowds didn't just watch, they participated in the spectacle. Worker graffiti at Deir el-Medina jokes about execution day food stalls, and some spectators brought their own stools to claim the best spots. A merchant's ledger lists selling beer at a markup during these events, but the experience wasn't for everyone. Medical papyri describe treating people who fainted from the sight and smell, and one letter tells of a priest who vomited during a boiling execution, losing face among his peers. The design of these venues reflected their purpose. At Memphis, raised platforms with stepped viewing areas ensured everyone had a clear line of sight. Temple records note that guards sometimes positioned walls to amplify screams, making sure the sound carried through the crowd. A Greek visitor once scratched graffiti at Abydos, bragging about seeing 3 skinnings and 1 boiling during his trip, proof that these events left an impression on locals and travelers alike. The methods themselves evolved to keep the audience engaged. Early on, quick executions were common, but by the New Kingdom, officials preferred slow, agonizing deaths. As one legal scroll put it, "A dead criminal teaches nothing." There are records of officials testing new punishments on small groups before rolling them out for larger crowds. The strategy worked. After a particularly brutal display, theft rates in some districts dropped by up to 80%. Tax records show that public executions led to higher compliance, and workers' diaries reflect a shift in tone. Less grumbling about overseers, more anxious mentions of the square. When we look at the ancient Egyptian justice system, it's easy to point and say, that was then, this is now. But the truth is, we haven't left those impulses as far behind as we'd like to think. Modern societies still find ways to make punishment a spectacle, even if the tools have changed. Public executions have morphed into viral court footage and endless social media commentary. Instead of flaying thieves in the square, we post mugshots and let the internet pile on. The hunger to see justice done, and to see it done publicly, hasn't faded. We just swapped stone platforms for screens. Take solitary confinement, for example. Locking someone away in a tiny cell with no human contact is legal in many parts of the world. Psychologists draw direct lines between this and the Egyptian spiritual erasure. Both are designed to strip away a person's sense of self. The method is different, but the goal is the same. Break the spirit, not just the body. Studies show punishers across eras share coping rituals like dark humor, strict routines, and emotional detachment to deal with the toll of inflicting pain. One modern corrections officer put it bluntly, "You stop seeing them as people. Just problems to process. The script may change, but the mindset echoes across thousands of years." We see the same logic in public shaming. Ancient Egyptians nailed skins to gates. Today, we have offender registries and viral callouts. Both rely on humiliation to warn others and keep order. The details change. No honey or bronze cauldrons, but the intent remains. Control through fear and spectacle. Even legal systems still bend toward power. Wealthy offenders often get lighter sentences, while the poor face the full weight of the law. The custom of tailoring punishment by social status isn't ancient history. It's still playing out in courtrooms worldwide. But there are signs we're learning. Forensic science now gives voices back to victims who were erased. DNA testing has cleared the names of people wrongly punished, and new technology lets us uncover stories that officials tried to bury. Instead of using records to destroy, we can use them to repair. Here's the real takeaway. Pain has never just been about justice. It's been about control, about reminding everyone who holds the power. We decide which ancient impulses to honor. Will history judge us kindly? Hit subscribe if you want to see justice served without cruelty. Because the legacy of Egypt's system isn't just gold and stone. It's the reminder that every society, old or new, has to choose what it's willing to do in the name of order. Egypt's golden treasures and polished vases shine differently when you know what funded them. The pyramids weren't just built by skilled hands, they rose on foundations of calculated cruelty, with every detail of punishment written into law and carried out with chilling precision. The lesson here isn't just about bloodshed, it's about how pain was engineered to control and how the machinery of justice can shape a society's soul. Understanding this brutality gives us a lens to question how justice is delivered today, and whether we're really as different as we think. Comment below with which method you found most shocking and how you think it compares to modern punishments. If you learned something that surprised you today, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more history uncovered.